So, hey guys, welcome to the first ever episode of the Take Back Your Career podcast. On this inaugural episode, I want to dive deeper into what this podcast is all about and give you some context around why this podcast was started. So, I want to share a little bit of a story that highlights the struggles that I faced at different phases or chapters, as I'll call them, in my career and in my life, and how it is the mission of this podcast to help other young professionals avoid those same pitfalls that I faced so far and early in my career. So in doing so, I hope that you can learn from my experiences so that you can, again, dodge the same sense of misery and lack of clarity in your own career. So without further ado, let's jump right into it.
You need to take action, and you're about to get real-world information and insight for fixing your career. This is the Take Back Your Career podcast with your host, Adam Fullerton.
All right, guys, so welcome to episode number 1 of the Take Back Your Career podcast, which is dedicated to helping you find happiness, fulfillment, and financial security in the work that you do. And we're going to do this by interviewing real experts who can provide actionable ideas, which can produce real results for you, our listeners. And each episode, we're going to have on a new guest and a new career coach or new expert or mentor, and use this information to, as the title says, take back your career. But before jumping into all of that, I want to start off with some storytelling, again, about my career and the lack of guidance and mentorship that I experienced, which caused me, again, to struggle through my career for nearly 7 years before figuring out the path that was going to provide me the sense of fulfillment and happiness and financial security that I was after. So let's start off with what I want to call chapter 1 of 4. And again, I want you to see if the way I felt and what I dealt with was or is similar to the way you feel as a young professional listening to this story. So let's start with my very first job out of college, in which I worked for a small agency of a much larger life insurance company. And, fresh out of college, I was super excited to join the workforce and start my first ever career position. So, of course, I hit the ground running and tried to be a sponge and learn as much as possible about the company and the industry I worked in. And my role originally was supposed to be all about marketing and helping the agency grow, which for those of you who don't know, I have a degree in marketing from Michigan State University. So I expected, as taking on this marketing role within the agency, that I was there just to do marketing, until I learned it really wasn't, even though it was a marketing role. And so what happened was it turned into more of a recruiting and administrative work type of job, which slowly over the course of a year made me go from loving the chance to take on a new job and start my career to dreading my first job and, of course, the path that I was on. And I ended up learning what the expression living the dream actually meant for people when you ask them how they're doing and they say, "Oh, I'm living the dream." And I learned what that meant really quickly, and I learned what it's like to pray for Friday every single Monday morning when you wake up at 7 a.m. or whatever time you might wake up when your alarm goes off. I learned what it was like to say, "Oh God, is it Friday yet already?" And it literally, the work week just started. So I learned too what it's like to be paid the same as your peers who don't work as hard as you, and so much more. And I figured all this out within the first year of my career taking off, and some people learn it a lot faster, and for some of you, it might take a lot longer to kind of learn these lessons. But what this really meant was that I was basically burned out after a year, and I knew, even though I thought my first job was going to be the best job, it ended up being the worst job. I knew already after a year only that I needed a new job and really needed to shake up my career. So begins what I'll call chapter 2, which is really when I left the small agency, the life insurance agency, and joined a very well-respected, well-known workwear apparel company in the area, which I spent the next 6 years of my life at, which is really chock full of both good and bad lessons, which will be shared throughout this podcast. Trust me. So when I first joined this company, I was brought in for a marketing position, which again was what my degree was in. So I was super excited for that and to get away from the recruiting and administrative work from the previous job. It was great. It really was. What happened in the first year at this company compared to the previous company was polar opposite. I ended up having an awesome boss. I was able to wear casual clothes instead of a suit and tie each and every day, and The schedule was flexible and so much more. It was truly polar opposite. And I was shocked to learn how much greener the grass could truly be on the other side compared to, again, where I was. So what happened here is really the next phase of my career began. About 9 months into my position at this new company, my manager actually moved to another position within the company, and I was basically tossed into the deep end in terms of learning how to balance a budget for an entire retail chain of stores. I was able to learn how to manage an annual promotion calendar, work with dozens of partners internally and externally, as they call it, and so much more. I was truly kind of the jack of all trades when it came to marketing in such a short amount of time. And I should have said, the only person on the marketing team once my manager transitioned into her new role. So there I was learning more in the next 3 months than the previous year combined at my previous job. And I will say I was promoted twice. I was brought on as a salaried employee, and I could actually finally say I was living the dream. No longer was I just saying, oh, living the dream because I was miserable, but I was like, hey, I'm actually living the dream. I landed a massive opportunity or a great job and had such great opportunity. I was truly stoked, and again, thought I was living the dream until I realized I really wasn't. So chapter 3 starts about 3 or 4 years into that same company that I was already at. And really the problem is that after the first couple of years of growth and progress and so much more, I was finally getting to the point where things started to tail off or taper off again. And I was starting to get bored. I was beginning to feel stuck, and I was starting to say, okay, what's next in my career and for my life? And so I began hearing more rumblings about how my friends and peers in the company and just around me in general were also feeling stuck and miserable, but just did what they needed to do to have a job and didn't want to rock the boat, so to speak. And at first I wasn't sure how that was even possible, but again, that based on my experience, because things were going so well for me personally. But then as time went on, I began to understand more and more than I ever thought I would. For really the next 2 or 3 years, I switched managers twice. I even made a lateral shift in terms of roles and moved out of the marketing realm altogether and got into operations. And I did this because I truly thought this was the next step or the natural progression of my career, and that the marketing side was over, and I needed to, of course, try something new altogether and kind of get on a new path to get to the next phase or chapter of my career, like I said. So I thought I needed a new perspective, and things would kind of go back the way they were before, when I felt like I was progressing and growing leaps and bounds, and each and every day it was just better than the day before, and I was learning so much. And unfortunately, this is all because, again, I was trusting the guidance around me, but that guidance I learned wasn't really based on what I wanted in my career. It was kind of what others thought I wanted in my career. It wasn't really about the happiness and fulfillment and financial security that I was looking for. And unfortunately, it was more like, hey, you're good at this, and this is how the company's trying to grow, so we think you'd be a great fit here. And that's at least what I feel like ended up happening for me. So I was simply unsure, honestly, what to do next. And I wasn't sure what was or wasn't right. So I listened again to those around me and ended up spending really the next, 2 or 3 years in a job and on a path that I wasn't proud of or excited for whatsoever. And I ended up becoming exactly what I became in my first job, which, again, was that feeling of being stuck and miserable. And I went back to actually saying I'm living the dream again, which, when you start saying that phrase, at least I'll talk about this a lot in this podcast, when you start saying you're living the dream and it's really just a lie, it's time to move on and that you need to get out of whatever situation you're in. So again, I would literally respond with that as a joke, even every time someone asked how I was doing, because I really had no other response outside of being brutally honest, which was that I hated my job and where I worked and the path that I was on. So let's talk about chapter 4 now, which I'm going to call the final chapter, and kind of wrap this all up for you guys and hopefully not make this story too long. But after about 5 years or so, I decided again that it was time to make a change and that I needed to do something now before I hit, my mid-30s and got stuck because of a house and kids and a new car, being married, and all those kind of obligations and life expenses that kind of pigeonhole you into a situation where you have to work somewhere instead of wanting to work somewhere. So I ended up leaving the company. Actually, it was my 6th year anniversary from the date I was hired, I decided to leave the company, and so I quit. And I remember being sick and tired of being bored and hating my job and feeling like there's no path to reach the goals that I still had in my career. And I was again back to feeling helpless and without guidance. That's a key term here, I guess a key point, feeling helpless and without guidance. That's kind of just what I've experienced through my own career. And so I will just say, like, what happened between my first job and my second job, I realized that I needed to do something. I needed to try something new. I needed to shake things up. And again, what I learned was that the grass can be greener on the other side yet again. So today, after leaving the previous company, I joined another company in the area, and I've been there for just over a year. And of course, I will say, I'll be the first to admit that I was scared as could be leaving my previous job after 6 full years. I kind of knew the place like it was the back of my hand. I knew the people, the processes, and everything. I was perfectly comfortable, which was, in my opinion, ultimately producing the misery that I was in. But again, I knew that it was time to either, accept that career of misery and that path that I was on, or shake things up. And that's exactly what I decided to do. So again, I moved companies and brought that passion with me to where I am. And I'm happy to say that it's far better than I could have ever imagined. And so the reason I'm telling you this story is because I wanted to share with you guys, how I got to this point and why this podcast exists. So again, I want to reiterate the point of this podcast, which is to help young professionals bridge the gap between the idea of I want and the idea of I have, and not even an idea, but a reality, right? And it's all about the young professional who is a few years or so into their career, and they're looking for the help, and they need to understand their worth when it comes to their career, and that they're in charge. You're in charge, and you need to take charge before it's too far down a path of misery and regret. And so again, this podcast is to serve as a resource for those of you who are seeking the guidance and the coaching and the mentorship and the experience or expert knowledge from real experts that can help you change the path you're on. And as the title says, take back your career. So hopefully the intent of doing this is really to help you guys avoid the same struggles and frustrations that I went through for the first 6 or 7 years of my career. Because if I had this type of help when I first started out, I think I'd be in a completely different place. But that's okay, because we're doing something about it now. And this is just a way for me to give back to you guys and, again, help bridge that gap. So again, thank you guys for listening to this inaugural episode, this short story format of an episode, which is going to be completely different than the rest of the episodes. But again, wanted to give you some context around where this podcast came from and my story. And hopefully, if you feel the same or have ever felt the same way, you'll know what you can get out of this podcast to avoid that struggle moving forward. So again, with all that said, I hope you guys enjoyed this story, and I look forward to many more episodes to come. And as I will always say, thanks for listening to this episode, and I will catch you guys on the very next episode. Take care.
Thanks for tuning in to this episode of the Take Back Your Career podcast with your host, Adam Fullerton, the podcast dedicated to giving you expert advice and actionable ideas so that you can achieve real results and finally take back your career. Like what you heard in today's episode? Consider leaving a 5-star review and visiting TakeBackYourCareerPodcast.com, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, or Spotify for more episodes. And remember, Mondays shouldn't suck, and neither should finding help. Thanks for listening to Take Back Your Career podcast.